This is probably the most iconic story in the Bible, a story that even people who are not religious will know about. Everybody's at least heard the phrase, the prodigal son. It pops up in popular culture all the time. I realized how iconic it was one day when I was teaching English at American River College, and one of my colleagues, who is a theater professor, she was in our department and taught plays and also directed plays, stopped me in the mailroom one day and said, "Tell me the story of the prodigal son," out of the blue. Now, I thought that was weird because I knew that she didn't think very much of my Christian beliefs and did not practice a religion or no longer practiced one. And also, she was a very smart, literate woman, and surely she knew the story of the prodigal son, or she could Google it. So I thought, why does she want me to tell her? So I recounted it, pretty much ending with the father putting the robe on the younger son and throwing him a great party. I don't remember saying much about the older son. And she said, "Huh!" That's all she said. And then a few weeks later, she told me this story. It turns out that she and I attended the same Catholic church. It was the church of her childhood. It was the church of my young adulthood and young parenthood, where I brought my daughter. And what had happened was she was in 5th grade. She was very interested in community theater, and she got a role in a play, and the rehearsals were on Sundays. So she wanted to go put on her fancy robes and act out a role on Sundays. So the parents took her there instead of church on Sundays. They ran into the priest one day. He asked where they'd been, and she explained very excitedly that she had a role in a community play. And he said that anything that took her away from church on Sunday was clearly devil's work, and she was going to hell. Now, I have to tell you, we priests make mistakes, okay? So I'm not pointing my finger at him. You know, let's not even look at the pile of mine behind me. But I sensed that that had put a huge wedge between her and God, and definitely her and any church. I realized also that I had not said much about the setting of the story, which is that Jesus tells it to a bunch of Pharisees, i.e. religious officials, and scribes, lawyers, who are critical because he is going to have a feast with tax collectors and sinners. That's what they're offended by. And so he tells them this story in which there's a judgmental, rigid, older son who is mad that his father is going to be compassionate and kind and loving and embracing to what he calls your son, also known as his little brother. It offends him. He's jealous. He's angry. He doesn't think that that younger son should get anything except maybe the job of a hired hand. What I notice about this story is the rigidity of sin and the softness of the father's treatment. Think about that robe. It says, get him a robe, and then there's a dash in the Greek and the English, the best robe. So it's not just any robe. Come back, make sure it's the best one. And then he puts the robe on his son. Now I want you to think of a time when you were dressed by somebody or somebody dressed you. You might be a child getting dressed by a parent. You might be swaddling your child as an infant or a grandchild. You might be putting somebody's hospital garb on them after you've given them a sponge bath. Just think of a time when you dressed somebody or they dressed you. It's a surprisingly gentle, intimate, loving time. The one I think of is, how many of you have had a child who said, I don't need a jacket, it's not cold outside. I'm like, you need a jacket, you're going to need a jacket. And you go somewhere, and they wouldn't put on the jacket, and now it's freezing and windy, and you have to give them your jacket because they're smaller and foolish. So you give them your jacket, right? How many of that have you done that for a child or a grandchild? Yes, yes. And probably I was that kid when I was little too, at Candlestick Park. It happens. It is a time of compassion, of closeness, of extreme love. And the thing about clothing, another thing I realized was I was trying to find something original to say about this passage, is that clothing is soft. Except our shoes, which have to meet the unforgiving hardness of the earth, clothing is soft, it's pliable, it's comfortable, it protects us. The only kind of clothing that isn't rigid is armor. And I think of the black plastic, the Imperial stormtroopers of Star Wars, or metal, the chainmail of knights in shining armor. It's unforgiving. It's defensive. It's meant to protect. And so this older son is protecting himself with judgment. He's also probably protecting his inheritance. Doesn't want any more of those fatted calves going out before his father dies because he needs more in that inheritance. But notice the rigidity of sin. It starts with the rigidity of the younger son. Impatience is rigid. Impatience tells us you must have it now, and it just creates this barrier in the brain to waiting. I've got to have it now, I've got to have it now. It creates a stiffness, a hardness in us. We will not wait. And that's what sets this whole story in motion. But then the older son's rigidity. He should not get anything good from you. He should suffer more negative consequences than he has already suffered. And his refusal to enter the party. If it's not done my way, we're not going to do it at all. It's very either-or thinking on the part of the older brother, when I think what so often Jesus is calling us to is a life of both and thinking. It can be this and it can be that. Notice that the father doesn't say to the older son, "Who are you to tell me what to do? I don't like your rigid judgmental nature. You're out of here." He doesn't do that. He says, "My son, everything that I have is yours. You will always have me." But this one was lost. Now, we don't know what happens to the older son, but I hope that he is persuaded at some point in the life of, fake people out there. I hope that he is persuaded at some point to come back, to treat his brother with kindness and gentleness, to recognize that his brother felt horrible about what had happened. The other thing that this story reminds me is that as ambassadors for Christ, how we treat people when they've done something that we consider really inappropriate is the mark of our Christianity. How compassionate we are, how loving. Think what happened when the priest said to that 10-year-old girl, "If you want to be in a play instead of come to church, you're going to hell." Think how better it would have been for her and probably for him if he had said, "Let me come and see you put on your fancy robes and do your play. And then maybe you can put on a robe and be an acolyte on church when you're done." We have an amazing power with our ability to show compassion and gentleness and flexibility, to clothe one another in forgiveness, and to recognize how much we ourselves are already clothed in forgiveness. Amen.